Longlegs was one of those films I kept putting off for the longest time. It sat in that category of movies I always assumed I'd get around to eventually, but never felt really any urgency to watch. Then one night I finally threw it on Netflix, and almost immediately there was this strange sense of familiarity that I couldn't quite place. Not because of the story or performances, but because of the way the film was framed. It felt like I'd seen this kind of visual language before, but twisted into something unfamiliar, and as the film went on, it finally clicked. Longlegs feels like what I can only describe as Anti-Wes Anderson. That sounds ridiculous on paper, because Wes Anderson and Longlegs couldn't seem more different tonally. But as someone who considers Wes Anderson to be one of my all-time favorite directors, and is very familiar with his filmmaking style, the connection started to make an eerie kind of sense. Wes Anderson's films are obsessed with control in a way that feels comforting, compact shots, centered framing, symmetry, carefully balanced compositions, architecture lining up perfectly around characters so every frame feels complete and visually satisfying, like a little dollhouse where everything exists exactly where it should. Longlegs feels like it takes that same level of visual intentionality and points it in the opposite direction. Characters are drifted off center, frames leave huge pockets of negative space, geometry almost lines up but never resolves in a way that feels pleasing, and static shots don't feel observational so much as they do oppressive, like the room itself is watching. Wes Anderson uses geometry to reassure you that the filmmaker is in control. Longlegs uses geometry to make that same control feel hostile and weird. Wes frames the world like a dollhouse you'd want to step into, while Longlegs frames the world like a room you absolutely do not want to be left alone in. And that's what makes it feel so weird, so wrong, and to me, unmistakably anti-Wes Anderson. The thing that immediately stood out to me while watching Longlegs was just how controlled every single frame felt. Horror movies usually create fear through movement, chaos, or unpredictability, but Longlegs often does the complete opposite. The camera is strangely calm, scenes are allowed to sit in uncomfortable silence, and shots linger long enough for you to start noticing the way characters are positioned within rooms rather than focusing just on the plot itself. It creates this feeling where the movie almost wants you to study the image instead of simply watching the scene unfold. And the more I paid attention to that visual control, the more it reminded me of Wes Anderson, except instead of making the world feel charming or carefully curated, it made everything feel deeply unnatural. That's what makes the comparison so interesting to me, because both filmmakers feel obsessed with visual intentionality, but they use it for completely opposite emotional outcomes. Wes Anderson frames the world in a way that reassures you everything is where it's supposed to be, while Longlegs frames the world like something has gone subtly, fundamentally wrong. Wes Anderson's cinematography is built around visual satisfaction, whereas movies are filled with centered framing, symmetrical architecture, balanced color palettes, and compositions that feel almost mathematically resolved. Even if you pause one of his films randomly, the image would usually feel complete on its own. Characters exist within the frame because the world around them seems designed specifically to hold them in place. There is a kind of warmth to that precision, almost like you're looking into a carefully assembled dollhouse where every object belongs exactly where it sits. Longlegs, however, uses precision in a way that feels hostile. Characters are constantly pushed awkwardly to the edge of the image, swallowed by darkness or isolated spaces that feel too large for them. The compositions are still deliberate, but instead of giving you comfort through structure, they create anxiety through imbalance. It feels like the film understands how pleasing controlled cinematography normally is, then intentionally refuses to give you that emotional release. One of the most unsettling things about this film is how static many of the shots are. Normally, a still camera creates a sense of calm because nothing is aggressively demanding your attention. But in Longlegs, the stillness still feels oppressive. The camera doesn't move because it doesn't need to move, it simply observes, almost like the room itself is watching the characters. And because the film constantly leaves large amounts of dead space hanging around people, your eyes naturally begin drifting away from the central subject and into the background. You begin scanning corners, hallways and shadows, as if you're expecting something terrible to emerge from them. the movie weaponizes the audience's attention in a really clever way. Wes Anderson also encourages you to explore the frame visually, but his environments are filled with charming details, carefully placed props, and theatrical symmetry that makes the act of looking feel rewarding. Longlegs makes looking feel dangerous. The longer you stare at the image, the more wrong it starts to feel. And I think that's why the movie leaves such a strong impression, even in scenes where almost nothing overtly scary is happening. Because a lot of horror films rely on obvious tension-building techniques like loud music, fast editing, or sudden movement, but Longlegs creates discomfort through visual denial. The compositions constantly feel like they're almost resolving into something symmetrical or visually satisfying before subtly drifting away from it again. A doorway might sit slightly off-center, a character might sit too far to one side, or a largely empty section of the image will pull your attention away from where your brain expects the focal point to be. It creates this constant subconscious frustration where the frame never really fully settles into harmony. Wes Anderson uses geometry and control to create reassurance, while Longlegs uses geometry and control to create emotional instability. And once that comparison clicked in my head while watching this film, I genuinely couldn't stop seeing it for the rest of the runtime. One of the biggest reasons Longlegs feels so uncomfortable to watch is because of how it treats empty space within its compositions. Most films try to guide your attention directly toward the important part of the scene, making sure the frame feels visually balanced and easy to read. Longlegs constantly does the opposite. Characters are often placed awkwardly to one side, while large sections of the frame are left hanging in darkness or emptiness. And the effect is deeply unsettling because your eyes instinctively begin searching those spaces for something hidden inside them. There are moments where a hallway, a doorway, or even just an empty section of wall feels more important than the person speaking on screen. The movie creates tension, not by showing you danger, but by making the frame itself feel, for lack of a better word, incomplete. Like there's something missing from it that shouldn't be missing. What makes this even more interesting is that the environments themselves are often visually simple. There usually aren't elaborate horror set pieces or exaggerated gothic interiors filling the frame. The locations feel mundane, grounded and recognizable, which makes the compositions feel even stranger. A normal room suddenly becomes oppressive, simply because of the way cameras choose to frame it. A doorway becomes threatening because it occupies too much visual space. A dark section of the image starts feeling dangerous because the film holds on for it just a little bit too long. And again, this is where the Anti-Wes Anderson comparison kept coming back into my head while watching the movie. Wes Anderson also pays obsessive attention to architecture, placement and spatial design, but his environments usually feel inviting and enjoyably theatrical. His worlds are designed to feel aesthetically complete. Longlegs uses similarly deliberate spatial awareness to make environments feel emotionally hostile. The film also understands something really important about human psychology. People naturally search for balance within images. When a frame feels symmetrical or visually resolved, our brains relax because the image makes intuitive sense to us. Longlegs constantly withholds that satisfaction. Shots often look like they're almost centered before subtly shifting away from balance. Rooms feel slightly too empty. Characters feel slightly too isolated. Large, dark sections of the frame dominate the image just enough to make your eyes uncomfortable. It creates this constant, low-level anxiety where the audience keeps expecting visual harmony that never fully arrives. Wes Anderson's cinematography often feels like visual closure, while Longlegs feels like visual tension stretched out endlessly. The movie knows exactly how compositions are supposed to feel, then deliberately manipulates those expectations to create unease. That's why so many scenes in Longlegs stay in your memory even after the plot details begin fading away. You remember the feeling of the rooms more than the events that happened inside them. You remember the sensation of staring into dark negative space, waiting for something to move. You remember the awkward placement of characters within frames and the strange emotional distance created between people and their environments. The horror doesn't just come from the story itself, it comes from the fact that the cinematography makes every location feel wrong before anything scary even begins to occur. Wes Anderson, as I am so fondly of saying throughout this video, uses visual precision to create worlds that feel comforting despite their artificiality, while Longlegs uses visual precision to make the world feel suffocatingly artificial in the worst possible way. The film turns composition itself into a source of dread, and that's what makes its horror feel so uniquely uncomfortable. The more I think about Longlegs, the more reason I have to feel so disturbed isn't just because of the story or its horror elements, but because of the entire film and its visual design to deny comfort. Almost every frame feels controlled in the same way a Wes Anderson frame feels controlled, except instead of using that precision to create warmth, charm, or visual satisfaction, Longlegs uses it to create visual distance, imbalance, and unease. Characters feel trapped inside rooms rather than belonging within them. Empty spaces start to feel threatening, and even the most visually simple scenes carry this constant subconscious tension because the compositions never fully resolve in a way that feels natural. The movie understands how comforting deliberate cinematography can be, then twists that expectation into something cold and oppressive. That's why I keep coming back to the idea of Longlegs as anti-Wes Anderson, because it genuinely feels like taking the same awareness of geometry, framing, and visual intentionality and pointing it towards the exact opposite emotional result.